there was no. Thank you.
Continuing where Victor left off. When the Hebrew people had first gone to Egypt, they were not slaves. Joseph had helped Egypt through a famine, and his family moved in, and they planted gardens and built homes, had families, they thrived. But a new Pharaoh came to power, one who did not know Joseph, one who decided that the Hebrew people were different enough, were numerous enough to be a threat. So the Hebrew people living in Egypt were enslaved and were subjected to laws and policies that tried to limit their childbearing, their movement, their bodily autonomy. How did it happen? How did they allow themselves to become enslaved? Why would people give up their freedoms? I suspect it was a slow process, this erosion of freedoms, little by little. Maybe they didn't really notice it until the shackles were on and it was too late. Maybe they thought Pharaoh was kind of a jerk, but his economic policies were good and maybe it would trickle down to them. Maybe they figured the next Pharaoh would see the injustice and reverse the policies and their freedoms would come back. Maybe they saw Pharaoh removing freedoms from other groups of people first, and so they didn't worry about it because it didn't involve them and they didn't want to rock the boat. Or as Victor was reading the story today and the Hebrew people were complaining, I wondered if it was their fear. They were just afraid of freedom. The Hebrew people cried out to God, and God heard the cries of God's people. And before today's story, the Hebrew people had left Egypt with Pharaoh's blessing. The plagues God had visited on Egypt made Pharaoh decide it was not worth the bother to keep his slaves. And as the story picked up today, Pharaoh changes his mind. It is hard to let go of a system of injustice and privilege when it benefits you. And so all of Pharaoh's army goes in pursuit of our plucky band of Hebrew slaves led by Moses. The text says the Israelites looked back and they saw their taskmasters coming for them. What I focused on, though, when I heard this story, when I was reading it this week, was this verse. The angel of God who was going before the Israelite army moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and took its place behind them. So you have the Hebrew people on the move, fleeing their lives of slavery, their bondage to Pharaoh. They're on their way to the promised land, but they have miles to go before they sleep. They've got a long journey ahead of them and a wide, wide river to cross. But they're not doing it by themselves. They are being led by the angel of God and by a pillar of cloud. But once you've decided which cloud it is you're going to follow, which pillar it is you trust, it then moves to the back of the group. There's some benefit to thinking there's somebody literally has your back, right? That there's somebody between you and the advancing Egyptian army. But it made me think about the relationship to the leader and the led. It's one thing to follow a leader. You trust that they know where they're going. The leader trusts that the people are behind them and will follow. It requires trust on both sides. But leading from behind is a whole different venture. On one level, I'm sure it was reassuring, as I said, that they have somebody had their back. But how did it feel to the people who were at the front? How many of them who had been happy to follow behind the cloud and the angel all of a sudden paused and said, which way do we go now? How many of them offered to let people behind them go first? No, really, I insist, you go first. And while I'm sure the angel and the pillar of cloud both had their hands full taking care of the Egyptians, I wonder if they were also wondering how things were going at the front of the line. They didn't turn left at that intersection, did they? They were supposed to turn right. I hope they went the right way. Because that's the problem of leading from behind. You have to let go. You have to trust that the people in front have learned from you and have learned how to find the path without your direct involvement. Leading from behind is an exercise in collaboration, with the leader and the led each playing an important role. I confess I hadn't thought much about the responsibility for their own journey that the Israelites had to make. I tend to think of them as sheep just following along wherever they are led, complaining about the conditions, forgetting about the promises. But if the pillar of cloud and the angel of God have gone to the back to take care of the back of the line, then they were more than sheep. Yes, they had Moses with them at the front, but they didn't have to follow him either. They could have said, yeah, thanks, we're going to wait for the cloud to come back. God does the delivering, but we still have to do our part to walk our way out of slavery. With their divine leaders at the back of the column, they reach the Red Sea and they wait for morning. Water on one side, approaching Egyptians on the other, and they wait in the darkness, and Moses stretches out his hand to part the waters. And all night long, the Israelites must have heard, I don't know actually what they heard, but they must have heard something. There must have been a sound that accompanied the parting of the water. And despite the fact that they're up against a large body of water and they have no boats, no life preservers, no inner tubes, they did not turn themselves back to Pharaoh as they had threatened to do. They remained facing toward freedom, even if it might be on the other side of a big swim. And all night long, while they hear the noise of the chariot wheels, the neighing of the horses, the sound of the Egyptians cooking their dinner and singing around the fire as they anticipate the rout and the destruction of the foolish Israelites in the morning. That's on one side. The other side, they hear the wind. And it's so dark they can't see what's going on, but you know something's happening to the sea. It's in this part of the story you can see the trust that's often hard to see from the Israelites in the rest of the Exodus story. They wait. They stay in place overnight, trusting that God and the pillar of cloud will take care of what's behind them and that Moses has some sort of plan for what's ahead of them. If they didn't trust, I suspect we'd heard of them deciding to quietly slip off one side of the waterfront or down the other. But they wait, and in the morning a miracle happens. I can't explain the miracle, and it doesn't seem worth our time to do that, but if you Google it, there's plenty of answers online. But I want you to notice when the miracle occurs in this story. It doesn't happen at the beginning of the journey. They follow the cloud and the angel for a while. The miracle doesn't happen in the darkness at the end of the day. They sit through that dark night not knowing what's going to happen. The miracle happens in the new day after a night of trust, after those weird sounds, after their worries. In some ways, maybe the miracle is a byproduct of their relationships that led to trust. Trust in who you follow, trust that the journey is heading where it's supposed to be going, trust that you're going to make it through the darkness. So here's our question. Who do you trust? And don't say God just because you know it's the right answer. It's easy to say that, right? We trust in God. But oftentimes it seems we say that, but we really only trust in ourselves. And I suspect there were a few Hebrew people like us, and I'm sure some of them were thinking, as I would have been, I'm sure God has it under control, even though it's dark, and I don't swim, and the Egyptians hate us, and it's dark, but I'm just going to let God take care of everybody else. And it's nice of God to offer to take care of me, but I'm fine. I'm just going to go over here, and I'm just going to wait it out, and then I'll follow along later. Anybody else? Just me? I don't think so. When it really comes down to it, we don't want to have to rely on anyone else, not even a divine anyone else. And in much of our lives, we get away with that illusion of control. We are very self-reliant people, which is fine to a point. Refer back to Joanne's sermon from last week. But God doesn't want us to lie down and wait for the bus to come and carry us out of slavery in the Promised Land. The Hebrew people had to walk, and we have things to do as well. But we have to remember not to confuse our participation in the Exodus with being in charge of the Exodus. We need to remember that God sometimes doesn't lead from the front of the line, but is protecting our backs. When the path forward isn't clear, it doesn't mean we're alone. So who do you trust to lead you? And as you do your part in our work of deliverance, who are you following? The Exodus, the deliverance from slavery to freedom, is not about the impressiveness of the Hebrew people. At every turn of the 40-year journey, it is about the power of God to deliver us from undeliverable situations. Rich Mullins was a contemporary Christian singer and poet, and one of his songs made me think of the Israelites in the wilderness. The song is called Hard to Get. And he writes, "What I really need to know is if you who live in eternity hear the prayers of those of us who live in time. We can't see what's ahead, and we cannot get free of what we've left behind. I'm reeling from these voices that keep screaming in my ears, all these words of shame and doubt, blame and regret. I can't see how you're leading me unless you've led me here to where I'm lost enough to let myself be led." Are we lost enough to let ourselves be led? Maybe that's our question to ponder this week. After the past few years, with all the loss and the disruption and the change, I think I relate to this wandering in the wilderness part of our faith story more than I ever used to, and I'm comforted by it. Sure, I might prefer an express train out of the wilderness times rather than being subjected to this time of wandering. But I'm reminded that when we're lost enough to let ourselves be led, God is there. I feel like when I look back on the last few years, I can see that in my life. I'm so thankful God led me here, to you, to this time. And if we trust God is leading us, how does that change the way we face the worries of the unknown future? It takes away my need to worry, even though things change and the path doesn't seem as clear as maybe it used to be. And it takes away the power of my fear. Maybe this is why the Hebrew people could sit by the side of the sea all night while their enemies were encamped around them. I'm sure they still had their fears, but they weren't overwhelmed by them. They stayed the course and walked through the parted water in the middle, in their miracle. We're beginning our season of stewardship this month when we prepare for next year's budget, when we make our pledges to support the work and witness of your church. God has led us here to this day, and God is leading us still. And your faithfulness in the past few years has provided for us through some very uncertain times. Calvary is well positioned to go where God will be leading us. And so we thank you for your faithfulness, and we hope you'll be prayerfully considering how your pledge to the work of the church is a sign of your trust that God is leading us toward a promised land and toward our miracle. I pray that when we find ourselves in the dark of night, with enemies encamped behind us and no clear path before us, that we will trust that our deliverance is not in our hands. We will not create our own miracles. When we are lost enough to let ourselves be led, it will be God who is our refuge, our very present help in times of trouble. Trust in that. Amen.